Hello, welcome to AB Lifetime, channel on transpersonal psychology. I'm Anna Bobikova, and today I am with Scott Giacomucci. And our topic today, considering the future of psychodrama. Hello, Scott.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me on. It looks like psychodrama's popularity is increasing again. The reason why he decided he wanted to be a doctor was because of his uncle. And his uncle actually died from a pandemic. Who knows where psychodrama would be right now in terms of its status in America? It would be very different.
It would be. Thank you for coming. I'm in Monterey, California. And this interview, we're supposed to do it in Chicago, at Chicago conference, in 78th Psychodrama conference. It's supposed to happen in Chicago in April. And because of the quarantine and stay at home, we had to do it online. Scott, in Pennsylvania. And what city are you in?
I'm in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Could you please share what kind of future do you see for psychodrama?
Yeah. Well, when I think of the future of psychodrama, I think there's many possibilities. There's many possible futures of psychodrama. Just like when I think of myself in the future, there's many possible selves. And I think it depends on what we do right now, what the current generation of psychodramatists does. If we, for example, do more research or get psychodrama into universities, psychodrama's future will look very different 20, 30 years from now. If we collaborate with the other mental health fields today, psychodrama's future will look much different. So I think we could have a future where psychodrama is known by everyone in the psychology field just as well as cognitive behavioral therapy is known. Or we could have a future that where psychodrama is not well known and where we continue to stay isolated from the larger field. But it really depends on what we do today. So it's up to us to decide what type of future we want to have.
How do you see the importance of connecting psychodrama to the mainstream fields?
Yeah, I think this is essential. I mean, when we think about when the psychodrama community in the United States at least was at its largest, it was when it integrated all the other group therapies and all the other creative arts therapies. And we had 2,000 people at our conferences. And then the creative arts therapies and the other group therapies went and created their own organizations and have their own conferences now. And we might get 300 or 400 people at our psychodrama conferences today. So when we were more inclusive and connected to the other modalities, the other fields, we were much more successful in terms of the psychodrama organization and the conferences. One thing I noticed is that the psychodrama community is tiny compared to these larger mental health fields. We have, I don't know, maybe 400 members in ASGPP. And NASW or APA, they have 120,000 members. That's 300 times larger than ASGPP. And one thing that I've noticed just in going to some of the other conferences that are put on by NASW, ACA, the Counseling Association, each of them have their own group work divisions as well. So ACA has the Association of Specialists in Group Work. They just had their conference in Puerto Rico a couple months ago, and there was maybe one other psychodramatist there. So they're doing the entire conferences on group work, but psychodrama is not very well represented. And I had the same experience at the International Social Work with Groups conference in New York. There was maybe 1-2 other psychodramatists at the entire conference. And it seems like people in the other fields, they've heard of psychodrama, they have a sense of it, they're curious about it, especially young people. From my experience, young people are really interested in it. But there doesn't seem to be many people actively integrating it into the other fields through publications, through teaching in the universities, within the degree programs, and through presenting at the conferences. Maybe we do a better job at the state level, presenting at state level conferences like NASW, Pennsylvania, or New Jersey. But I think that's one area where we could really make a big impact by getting psychodrama out there to larger audiences. A large part of my academic work has been on trying to integrate the philosophies of social work with Moreno's methods. And this was actually what my dissertation was on. And through that, I created a MSW course curriculum that took social work with groups, philosophy and theory and practice, and tied in Moreno's methods to it, where I really present Moreno as a social worker. And if you think about it, he worked with individuals, groups, families, communities, did a lot of social justice work. He worked with oppressed and marginalized communities, just like a social worker would. I even argue that the social work field is the closest field we have to his vision of societry. Healing, creating healing in the larger society. And right now I'm writing a book on social work as it relates to sociometry and psychodrama. So, I mean, this is just the social work field. There's counseling, there's psychology, there's marriage and family therapy. I think there's so much opportunity for us to integrate psychodrama into these other fields and really introduce new people to Moreno's methods in that way.
Is it correct that you feel like that psychodrama field in the US have shrank in last years? So it was bigger and something happened and it became smaller.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely has gotten smaller. I don't know precisely in terms of the dates and years. It seems like in the 60s it was pretty big and they were getting 2,000 people at their conferences.
Okay.
And then it seems like it got smaller and smaller. And it almost seems like the rise of evidence-based practice coincides with the shrinking of psychodrama.
It's like thriving there and shrinking here for some reasons.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I have limited experience internationally in the psychodrama communities, but from my experiences internationally, it seems like psychodrama is much more popular, much more accepted. Even in some countries, it's considered an evidence-based practice by the governments, specifically in Austria, I believe, Hungary, Israel too. I mean, Brazil, I believe, has the largest psychodrama community in the world. So it's really thrived around the world, but become marginalized in the United States. So I think we have a lot to learn from others.
Because this was my internal question since I moved to the US. And by the way, I moved from Russia, right? And there is psychodrama is thriving. And when I studied, I completed like one of the first core trainings for 3 years. And since that, it's like at that moment there were only 2 main instructors in the country, and right now it's just spreading and very, very popular. And that's what I had always like internal question. First for me was I'm a visual person, and I observed here in the US most very well trained psychodramatists, they are the youngest in their 60s, and then 70s and 80s and 90s. And then it's like kind of almost like nobody there in the field, just a couple of people in their 30s, 40s.
Yeah, there's like a missed generation in the psychodrama community.
Right. So it means for me that, for instance, like 20 years ago, something happened, then people stopped entering the field.
My sense of some of that is that in the United States, psychodrama really got adapted by some of the other social movements, like the therapeutic communities, the encounter movement, T groups, and some other mutual support groups. And people started using psychodrama without training.
Yes.
And even some of the therapeutic communities, they were using what they called attack therapy.
Okay.
And really hurting people with psychodrama.
I see.
So in one sense, Moreno would have been thrilled that his methods were being used outside of psychotherapy, because that's what he intended.
Yeah.
And it was getting into the larger culture, but it also got disconnected from its philosophical foundation and the theory and training. And my experience of a lot of professionals that are kind of in that lost generation of psychodrama is that they'll tell me, oh, I did a psychodrama group 20 or 30 years ago, and it was dangerous. It scared me, or someone committed suicide after it, or it wasn't, I don't think it was safe for clients. So I think it was really used without proper training. And we know a lot more now about trauma, about safety, about neurobiology, and there's ways that psychodrama practice has evolved and new models have emerged, specifically the therapeutic spiral model and the relational trauma repair model, which allow us to use psychodrama in a trauma-informed and strength-based way. It allows us to make it safer. So one thing I've also noticed is in the past, it's hard to put a year on it, but I noticed 2013 there was an influx of new psychodrama books published. And in the last year, I believe they had a record number of applicants for psychodrama certification, the American Board of Examiners. Another kind of observation is that the Social Work with Groups Journal is doing their first ever special edition on psychodrama. So it looks like psychodrama's popularity is increasing again in the past 5 years, maybe the past 7 years. It seems like it's becoming popular, maybe because of the neuroscience research, maybe because the people are more interested in the creative arts therapies. Maybe it has to do with the American Psychological Association recognizing group psychotherapy as a specialty, which was a big deal. I think that happened 2 years ago. So I think we're kind of on the edge of psychodrama rising again in popularity in the United States. I hope so, at least.
I am paying attention to your professional work, and I see how much you are like putting inside the field by your articles and everything. By the way, I will definitely put all the links to your articles, your books underneath the video. It's wonderful because you are that one of the people from young generation who entered the field. Scott, could you please tell a little bit more about psychodrama in universities?
Yeah, so and you probably already know, of course, but one thing I've noticed is that internationally, there's plenty of universities that offer entire graduate degrees in psychodrama. Like in different countries, you can get a master's degree or even a PhD in sociometry, psychodrama, and group psychotherapy.
Exactly.
However, here in the United States, it's hard to even find a group therapy course that mentions psychodrama or Moreno. So there's a real absence of psychodrama and Moreno's methods in academia in the United States. It seems like, 30, 40 years ago, there was a lot more psychodrama courses. And there was even, at Westchester University, Tom Treadwell had a master's in psychology with a concentration in psychodrama.
Ah, okay.
I believe that was the only one we've had in the United States. I could be wrong.
Uh-huh.
But we've failed to professionalize in the same way that drama therapy has. They have, I believe, 5 master's degrees in North America. Or creative arts therapies, expressive arts therapies. They have master's and PhD programs in the United States. Art therapy, music therapy.
And drama therapy. Drama therapy, it's another thing which came out of psychodrama, and it is much more popular now in the US. That's what I see.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed is that they've done a better job than psychodramatists have in terms of publishing, in terms of doing research, in terms of creating graduate courses. So I think this is an area where we're lacking, and my judgment is that some of it is our own faults. I published an article in the Psychodrama newsletter last year about professionalism, specifically about how we tend to scare people away from psychodrama when we do demonstrations at conferences or guest lectures where there's no emotional containment and we just go straight for the catharsis and, have someone doing their trauma work in a classroom. I've seen trainers do this constantly.
Okay. I see what yes.
I would even argue that a lot of psychodrama training events, it would be hard to differentiate if it was a personal growth workshop or an educational event. And I think we can do better there. If we can really create some standards and some differentiation between what psychodrama training looks like in an ongoing training group, where it would be more appropriate to do that personal work versus in a classroom, in an academic setting, where there needs to be more boundaries and containment. And the students are going from your psychodrama class into another class. So that, they need to be put back together.
Feel safe, right? Just out of this room where they did the personal work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one area where we could really improve, and it would allow psychodrama to be accepted within academia more. And once we get it into universities, universities are just pumping out young people every year. Hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of new young people enter the mental health field from universities. And if we could introduce them to psychodrama while they're there, while they're still trying to decide what kind of therapist they want to be or what kind of professional they want to be, I think we could really create a different future for psychodrama. And it would lead to more resources related to research. Because it's tough to do research if you don't have a university support. So there's lots of benefits to getting psychodrama into the university.
Yeah, I agree. And by the way, we were speaking with you. Remember that emails about just discussing this potentially the master's program and how wonderful it would be to do that. And I'm very happy that we are doing this interview, because I'm sure that there are potential students and students who are getting their bachelor's in psychology right now and which are thinking about what to do as a next step. What in psychodrama's past we should consider as a connection to the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot that we can learn from examining our past, and every therapist believes that. Otherwise, we wouldn't ask our clients about their individual pasts, right?
Right.
So when I was doing my doctorate program, I had a class with Sandy Bloom, who created the sanctuary model, and she asked us to write a paper examining an organization's history through the lens of trauma theory, developmental theory, and applying psychodynamic concepts to its history as it impacts its present today. And I wrote about the ASGPP, the American Psychodrama Organization. So I did a lot of historical research.
I see that.
And this was at the same time that we were editing Moreno's autobiography that we published last year. So I was really in the midst of all the history. And one thing that I noticed, and others have written about this too, is how we tend to reenact some of Moreno's personality traits as psychodramatists. Some positive ones, like his creativity, his spontaneity, his compassion, his humor, his genius even. And we continue to reenact some negative personality traits of his narcissism, his professional isolation, or his unwillingness to adapt to academic standards or professional standards. So I think this is one area where we could really learn from. A lot of people don't realize Moreno was actually nominated to be the chair of Harvard University's sociological department at one point. And one of his students stood up and said, I don't think Moreno would want to be the chair because he wouldn't want to try to confine himself to academia. He just wouldn't be willing to do it. And Moreno writes about how grateful he was that this student stood up and defended him.
Wow, thank you for this story. That's great. Thank you.
Imagine if he had taken that position, though, in psychodrama. I mean, if Moreno had been the chair of the sociology department at Harvard, who knows where psychodrama would be right now in terms of its status in America? It would be very different.
It would be.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is one area where we could learn from psychodrama's past. I mean, Moreno definitely developed a lot of enemies. I mean, he constantly was critiquing Freud, and then he and Sam Slabson kind of had a little rivalry going on where Slabson went and founded the American Group Psychotherapy Association the year after Moreno founded ASGPP. And rather than collaborating with other leaders in the field, Moreno seemed to want to do his own thing. I think this is an area where we can learn not to reenact that too.
Actually, who organized and put it in certain order? First one was Zerka, who kind of put it in certain structure, psychodrama. Because if I understand correctly, it was before. It was just just pieces.
Yeah. Well, Moreno, I mean, he kind of generated all these ideas and then tried to organize them together and was changing the ideas and refining them as he went. I mean, it does seem like Zerka really took his ideas and translated them to make them more understandable and organized them in a way that made them easier to learn. One thing I constantly remind myself of when I'm reading Moreno is that he's writing in English, but English was, I think, his fourth or fifth language. Right? So, I mean, his writing's very difficult to understand. But when we consider that, English was was not his first language, it makes a little bit more sense.
Right. And as a genius person, he had very, like, you have talents in one area of life, you might be not that genius in the languages.
Yeah. Yeah, this is true. He writes a lot in his autobiography about the role relationship between being a social scientist and being a mystic, and how he saw them as complementary, but many other people saw them as conflicting roles. How could you be a social scientist if you're also a mystic writing about spirituality and God? So a lot of his autobiography is talking about the relationship between these two roles that he experienced.
Psychodrama online, and specifically why I'm asking this question, since today, like, we are not even questioning, right, at this moment of our what we have with this shelter in place and quarantine, and many people are predicting very bad scenario that we will be locked, like, partially in next 3-5 years. So we are not right now even questioning about psychodrama online. And I know it changed so drastically and so quickly, because only 2 years ago, when I would say, because I was doing psychodrama online, and I would say, yes, I'm doing that, specifically here in the US, people would be like, I saw that it was not that much of agreement with me that it is good thing to do. And right now I see, now we don't even question. So we have the choice just to do it or not, because only one way how to do it is online. So my question is, how do you see just maybe generally, how do you see future of psychodrama online and your personal attitude to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And just to tie it into the history too,
Right.
a couple of historical points to note. One, when the pandemic started, I went and searched through the autobiography to see if Moreno wrote at all about pandemics. And there's a couple historical references that really shaped Moreno's thinking.
Thank you so much for pointing this, because I actually wanted to say, and I just lost this thought, sorry for interruption, but you published yesterday on Facebook great post on revolutions and the steps, and right now you feel like there is a step of, could you please, yes, describe this more?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll kind of tie all that in. Kind of tying it into the history here, in his autobiography, Moreno writes that the reason why he decided he wanted to be a doctor was because of his uncle. And his uncle actually died from a pandemic in Istanbul, or what was then Constantinople. So from an early age, he was really impacted by pandemics. Later, in his work in Mittendorf and the refugee camps in Austria, he writes that a pandemic took over the refugee camp, and all of the medical doctors became too ill to work or died except for him. He writes that it happened in 1916, which would have been 2 years before the Spanish flu. So I wonder if it may have been the Spanish flu or not. But he says at one point he was the only medical doctor in the entire refugee camp with 10,000 refugees. So, I mean, he was not a stranger to illness and pandemic. Even the events leading up to his death in 1974, there was a flu epidemic going around that led to his physical decline. So from his early story, his early childhood of wanting to become a doctor because his uncle died of this illness, to his experience in the refugee camps where he developed sociometry and experiencing the pandemic there, and then to some of the events leading up to his death. He really had experience with pandemics. It's interesting when we talk about teletherapy and online to think about what Moreno would have thought about all this, right?
Yes.
A lot of people don't realize when he migrated to the United States in 1925, he writes that he came with 3 ideas. One was the psychodrama stage. One was the sociogram of sociometry. But the third was a recording device, a new piece of technology that he was developing. And he wanted to use this technology to create a therapeutic experience for larger audiences than he could do on a stage. So 1925, 95 years ago, he was thinking about how can we use technology to create a therapeutic and healing experience for larger groups of society. The Facebook post that you mentioned that I put out yesterday was kind of an observation I was thinking about. I was actually in an IAGP committee meeting for the Trauma Disaster Task Force, and Marcia Karp was talking about some of the history of psychodrama. And I started to think about the evolution of psychiatry in the mental health field. And I was remembering a quote that from Moreno. Moreno says that there were 3 revolutions in psychiatry. The first being with Pinel, who, I believe this was in Paris, he suggested that instead of punishing or criminalizing people with mental illness, that we should treat them humanely. This was the first revolution in psychiatry. The second came with Freud. Freud was actually a neurologist, and he suggested, the reason why he's the father of psychology is because he suggested that instead of considering mental illness as a neurological problem, that it's actually a psychological problem. Instead of only focusing on the brain, we should be considering the mind. The second revolution in psychiatry. The third, Moreno writes, was the emergence of group therapy. That instead of treating individuals isolated one at a time, that we could treat larger groups of people. And that this was the third revolution in psychiatry. And I proposed that the fourth revolution is what we're in the midst of right now. That the shift to teletherapy and telehealth is the fourth revolution in psychiatry in the mental health field, that we're no longer confined to geographical location in terms of providing treatment, that we can make therapy much more accessible now that we're using teletherapy. And I think this is going to become the new normal to some sense, both in therapy and in education. And when it comes to psychodrama, I think it was really timely that the Board of Examiners last year changed their training requirements and are now allowing some online training hours.
I know, and I was thinking lately, and I thought that my inner feeling that they will have to revise it again and let more, if we are going to be in such situation for 3 or 5 years, they will have to, and not only.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, when I look at the larger education field, I mean, most universities offer online degree programs, or at least hybrid programs.
Exactly, yes.
My doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania, it was mostly online. We went to campus once a year for an immersion in person for 3 to 5 days. Everything else was online.
My doctorate program is online also, and also I go there twice a year for the intensive, yes.
And wouldn't that be a great model for psychodrama training?
Absolutely, absolutely, and yes. Well, and just reality, for instance, I'm thinking about even 2020. In 2020, I can already predict that there won't be any in-person hours people were able to get.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So it means that if people just cannot access these in-person hours, then how they can get these hours?
Yeah, it's a real spontaneity test for all of us.
I know.
I know. I just like this idea. Me personally, I love the online idea.
I was really resistant to it at first. I was really resistant.
I remember we had these emails even like a year ago, and it's interesting how time changes. Yes, I know. We can talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I really advocated that theory and history could be taught online, but that the experiential piece couldn't be. And I'm proven wrong. Everyone's doing it. Even I was forced to change I was in the middle of teaching an MSW course on psychodrama when the pandemic broke out, and the school said for the rest of the semester your class is online. So I had to figure out how to teach psychodrama online for that class, and we managed. We almost every session we did some sort of sociodrama or psychodrama vignette. We modified sociometry tools to be used online. I think what was most helpful for me was learning from Daniela Simmons, who created Teledrama.
Yes.
I did an hour or two of consultation with her that was amazingly helpful. She seems to really be on the cutting edge of moving Morena's methods online.
Yes, yes. I love also, I remember Kate Hudgens a long time ago, she wrote a book. I do not remember exactly the name of the book, but there is the whole chapter on online that was helpful for me too.
Yeah, she has a chapter on telemedicine. And Kate, I mean, because of her international work, it seems like she's been doing online psychodrama supervision for a long time. I know when I was in training with her, we used to do psychodramas through Zoom, and she would have me roll reverse with an object in my room for supervision, and that was probably my first introduction to psychodrama through Zoom or FaceTime.